Um,
Okay. Well, the top one is the second clock. That was 2 weeks later.
yeah,
So you see a circle, you see all the numbers are there, still
right.
disorganized, whole lot of hands of the clock.
Yeah.
And then 37 days is the bottom one there. It's kind of cleaned up there. And then he told me, he says, well, what I was trying to do was, draw a line to try to match up the numbers to get them across from each other on the clock. He said he wasn't drawing hands of the clock. He told me that later,
Yeah.
and I thought, well, that's really interesting, but this was a huge improvement from those few little circles. Really keto for healthy brain aging and Alzheimer's prevention. But so you'll learn about the problem of eating too much sugar. I think that is like one of the number one problem with the diet right now. People are just eating too much sugar, and a lot of it's high fructose corn syrup in these processed, ultra processed foods. It's extremely inflammatory and damaging, and it probably explains most of the complications of diabetes. Just the fact having a chronically elevated blood sugar. And type 2 diabetes can be reversed with a low carb diet, higher fat diet. And people, Dr. Eric Westman, another MD at Duke University, he's had over 4,000 patients. He's been doing this for 20 years. He gets 80% of them get off completely insulin and their oral medications for diabetes. They lose weight. They get their hemoglobin A1C back down to normal over time. It takes time, but they can go into remission with their diabetes. And he calls it remission. They're not cured because if they go off the diet, it will come back.
It'll go.
Insulin, if you can get rid of it by eating healthy, and it'll help your brain. It's a great risk factor. 30% of people with diabetes will develop dementia. It's a very big risk factor. So then we talk a lot about the diet. So it's a whole food Mediterranean ketogenic diet, and I go basically through each food group and each macro protein, what's important, what you need to know about it, why each food group is important, and basically how to formulate it, how to plan it into a ketogenic diet. And it doesn't have to be super strict. A lot of people are responding to what's called mild nutritional ketosis, where their ketone levels are in the 0.5 to 1.5 range. But it helps when you include the coconut MCT oil. It makes it easier to do that and to maintain the ketone level. But then, there are a whole bunch of other things. Well, I talk about the ketone supplements in here, and then things like overnight fasting and exercise can stimulate ketones. Overnight fasting's gotten to be very popular. It's a great way to control your weight too, but it does put you into mild ketosis if you do nothing else. But then I go into things to do and things to avoid, foods to eat and foods to avoid, a whole bunch of things beyond ketones. For example, there are medications that a whole slew of medications that are anticholinergic. So to explain what that is, there's a chemical in the brain called acetylcholine, and it has to do with memory. It's very important to memory, and it's deficient in Alzheimer's disease. So acetylcholine is the target for the only drugs, 3 out of the 4 drugs that are available for Alzheimer's to try to increase acetylcholine levels. So when you take an anticholinergic drug, you're actually reducing the level of acetylcholine, and so what are these? These are cold remedies. We're talking about decongestants, antihistamines, cough medicines, sleep aids like Benadryl, doxylamine, that's a NyQuil, all of those things. You feel kind of foggy after you take them. You have a dry mouth, that kind of thing. It's because you're decreasing your level of acetylcholine in your brain when you take them. And there's certain antidepressants that fall into that category too. So I've got a section on medications that can worsen, can cause confusion, can worsen dementia. So people that already have it may get more confused. And some of them are for bladder control. I mean, just so many different medications that can do this. And some people are taking multiple medications. After I, when, Steve, over time, I ended up switching from newborn ICU to doing hospice, believe it or not, opposite end of I did that for 3 years. And I couldn't believe some people are on 20, 25 medications. and they were taking medications for the side effects of their medications. And a lot of them were taking a ton of these anticholinergic medications. Yeah. And I went from, I did hospice for a few years, and then I kind of transitioned. I was traveling a whole lot, and I found this great job that I could schedule however many days or few I wanted, doing home health risk assessments. And I loved it because I could spend an hour and a half with people. You review their entire medical history, medications, and make recommendations. I didn't make changes, but I could make recommendations. And we talked a lot about diet. A lot of these people had diabetes, and some of them were on 3 or 4 oral medications, 2 forms of insulin, and another injectable. And I'd say, well, let's talk about what you're eating. And they're still drinking Coca-Cola. They eat cereal for breakfast. It's just carbs, carbs, carbs all day. And I said, did you ever have any instruction on your diet on like cutting out carbs? And they're like, I don't, what are carbs? You know, they didn't remember. If they did, somebody maybe handed them a piece of paper or talked to them for 5 minutes about it. But but I would talk to him about it. And a couple of them, I came back and saw him the next year. And there was one, he actually had lost quite a bit of weight. He was a younger man who was debilitated, from diabetes. And, because they also get heart disease along with it, high blood pressure, kidney problem, they have so many other problems just because they're diabetic. And so if you can just eat less carb, get rid of those sugary beverages and, all the extra sweets, ultra processed foods, you could live out the second half of your life in much better condition, much better quality of life, not be stuck to your home because, you're, you can't feel your feet when you walk from peripheral neuropathy. And, before 2006 is when we suddenly transitioned to a Mediterranean diet, as a physician, I got 3 hours one afternoon on nutrition, how food affects disease, for the good or the better. I mean, 3 hours, that was it. It was all about pharmaceuticals, really. So I didn't know how to feed myself, my family. I was going with the guidelines, which were low fat, eating reduced fat, everything, skim milk. And the base of that food pyramid said 6 to 11 servings of grains a day. It was like, I was like, yay, I thought that was good, but I'm eating all this reduced fat. I was watching my calories, and I got heavier and heavier. I weighed 60 pounds more then than I do now, on that diet, which I call the convenience food diet. We were going to a lot of fast food places and, eating those big packaged meals from Sam's Club. You could throw them in the microwave, all the processed food, and it just terrible diet, which probably contributed to Steve's Alzheimer's. And then I came across a study that they showed that the people who with Alzheimer's who ate the most Mediterranean-like diet lived 4 years longer on average than the people who ate the least Mediterranean-like diet. And that was the first time it ever occurred to me that Alzheimer's could have anything to do with diet or nutrition. And we just very quickly transitioned over. I read about all different kinds of diets. And then I decided, okay, the Mediterranean diet sounds like it's the best, of what I have read. And then including omega-3 fatty acids too. That was something that was relatively new in the 1990s, but there wasn't really that much, there wasn't much talk about, that people really need to be getting omega-3 fatty acids. And so we started adding that too. There was a trial for Alzheimer's. And I thought, this is an essential fatty acid. I'm not going to risk that he gets placebo. I'm just going to give it to him, So, but for 2 years, he was on that diet and he still got worse. I don't know if it slowed it down. I benefited tremendously because I did lose weight. I was pre-diabetic. That all got better, so many things got better. But it didn't help Steve, improve anyway, but then, it was still worth doing. I've maintained that ever since. But it's an incredibly healthy diet, and, making it keto, there's kind of two things. One, overcoming insulin resistance. And that's another chapter in my book. It's a big chapter. This one took me, the first 10 months I was writing was just this last chapter. And it's so heavy on the science that I decided not to make it the first chapter. I thought nobody will ever read the rest of the book. It's what goes wrong in the Alzheimer brain. And it goes cell by cell by cell. It plaques, tangles, inflammation. It explains all of this. And as I was reading, I read probably a couple hundred review papers, scientific articles, to put this together, which is why it took me so long. But the constant thread was insulin resistance. That insulin resistance promotes inflammation. It promotes formation of plaques. It promotes formation of tangles. But then the plaques actually cause more insulin resistance. It's like a vicious cycle. The tangles cause more insulin resistance. It's just perpetuating, and it probably explains why it's progressive, why it's just this constant decline, downhill. And the other thing too, and this is Dr. Stephen Cunnane in Canada again, he's been doing these ketone and glucose PET scans, and he's scanned more than 300 people, adults of all ages, but focusing on the elderly and healthy, normal, older adults, and people with Alzheimer's, people with mild cognitive impairment. And he has found that there is what he calls the brain energy gap. So like, say you're 70 years old, but your memory, everything seems fine. There's about a 7 to 9% gap between how much energy your brain needs and how much it actually gets. And your brain does shrink a little bit every year, and it's possibly because it's just not getting enough energy. So he's done studies with, he's focused on MCT oil, and now he's doing a study with ketone salts. But he has found that, just taking 2 tablespoons a day of MCT oil, that it does increase uptake of ketones in the brain just from taking MCT oil. And it improves cognition. There's like 5, they call them 5 cognitive domains. And the people that he studied for 6 months, they had improvement in all 5 domains. And he was actually able to show that the white matter in the brain lit up. I mean, he's got astounding pictures in some of his studies, before and after. You can see, that there's very little ketone uptake before the MCT oil. And after, it lights up, the ketones, it just lights up. The study was with MCT oil, but now he's studying ketone salts. He has done other studies. He did another study with ketone salts, and he looked at the brain, and it showed that too. But the heart and the kidneys light up with ketones too. They love ketones. And and there are studies out there now showing that congestive heart failure can respond to ketones. And recovery from acute heart attack, it can that taking ketones can benefit that. And kidneys, he concluded that it could help people with kidney disease too, because the kidneys prefer fatty acids to glucose as fuel, and they light up with ketones. They just take them in immediately. And this was with ketone salts. So he wants to do other studies with the ketone ester. He was having trouble finding a placebo, because you have to be able to give a placebo so people won't think that they're, that they'll think they're getting the placebo,
this 2-stroke engine.
But I know he's planning to do that. But right now he's beginning studies with ketone salts. But he has shown that the higher your ketone levels, the greater the ketone uptake is in the brain, But then there are these other factors with coconut oil. It might act directly in the brain. And then there's other studies out there showing that MCT oil acts directly as a fuel in the brain, and astrocytes in the brain that nourish the neurons. So MCT oil converts the ketones, but it also is a fuel itself, in and of itself, for the brain. There's a group in there's a group in Australia that they put out big reviews about coconut oil and Alzheimer's disease. They're an Alzheimer research group, so they do everything Alzheimer's. But they decided to actually investigate this instead of just poo-pooing it right away, like a lot of these people do. They decided to let's check this out, And so they've written a beautiful paper. They talk about the medium chain triglycerides, but all the other factors in coconut oil. There's even substances that can help inhibit or prevent the formation of those plaques in the brain, and decrease inflammation, like I said. So there's a lot going on for coconut oil, and they've written papers about it. But I've gotten to visit coconut farms and coconut factories in the Philippines and Thailand, and there are these big producers, and like I said, a lot of people just put their label on it here in the U.S., and you can be getting the same product and paying double for it from one company versus the other. There's three salts, there are a lot of generic ones out there. I call them generic. They're extremely high in sodium or potassium sometimes. So, I tend to encourage people to stay away. They might be a little bit less, but Prove It's got a good brand. They have all kinds of flavors. They're constantly adding new flavors because you kind of get tired of drinking the same old thing. They're on the expensive side, and it's multi-level marketing, so a lot of people don't like that, Real Ketones is another one. And then the Keto Start is a new favorite of mine too. So I like to be, what do you call it? Ecumenical, where you, I don't like to pick favorites because I'm so involved. I try to help people get on this, and there's different price ranges. Different people want different things, so I tell them what's out there and let them explore for themselves, For the ketone esters, Human is no longer in the ketone ester business per se.
Really?
Yeah. Ketone Aid is the Dr. Veach's ketone ester. If you want to get Dr. Veach's ketone ester, what Steve had, it's Ketone Aid. And then T Delta S is his partner, Dr. Kieran Clark, Dr. Veach's partner, who she did a lot of the athletic performance studies with the ketone ester. She has a company, T Delta S. It's pricey. I would say it's pricey compared, and both the esters are pricey. It's a very expensive process to make this ketone ester. And then there's another company out there called Kinetic. It's Kenetik. And it's basically the two components that are in the ketone ester, but they're basically mixed together. And oddly enough, it doesn't taste nearly as bad, and it costs a lot less because they don't have to go through that process of making the ester. And I think if you were taking higher doses, you might have to worry more about that the beta hydroxybutyrate, the ketone, is a free acid, but it's buffered. And, most people take lower doses. Some super duper athletes take really high doses of this stuff. And Steve was taking a very high dose of it. But at these lower doses with it being buffered, the acid doesn't seem to be a problem, but so there are a lot out there. I have I have links to a lot of these on my website. I have a website. It's coconutketones.com, and ketones is spelled Ketones. A lot of people try to put a Y in it, but it's coconutketones.com. So I have links to all of these, and so it's, people can explore and they can see what fits into their price range. I kind of encourage, get a small amount first, especially a ketone ester. Some people with Alzheimer's, they won't drink it, they spit it out, and other people they can't stand it. And I hate for them to buy a 2-month supply and then find out, they're not even going to drink any of it. It's very expensive. Ketonate is too, but Human, they're selling just the butanediol component of it now, it's rather interesting because it gives you a buzz. So they kind of sell it for that reason. But I worry about, why are you getting the buzz? If it was ketones, you wouldn't feel like that, I don't think, if it was just pure ketones. So something else is going on. And
right.
So I'm not real fond of those particular products, but the ketone ester did turn my husband around when he was at a point that he was starting to lose ground, and it sustained him. I mean, it reversed everything over some of it 24 hours later. He was back to being able to just, it's hard to explain, but he could just shave and take a shower and wash his hair. He could just do all these things that the day before I'd have to talk him through. I'd have to stand there with him and talk him through taking a shower. Get your hair wet. Okay, now put the shampoo in your hair. Okay, now rub it around, and then he could just suddenly do it, and that's what that did for him. And then over about 6 weeks, everything else that he had from that semaglutide reversed. And I didn't get to mention the semaglutide. We got the news a few months after he stopped taking it that it accelerated Alzheimer's. They stopped the study because it actually accelerated Alzheimer's. So that explains, really what happened to Steve at that point, almost for sure. What else could it have been? It was right when he was taking it for about 6 weeks. And it only took, and then in the studies, they found that it did reduce the plaques, and it greatly reduced the tangles, which they weren't expecting. And it's like, okay, you're reducing the plaques and tangles, but the people get worse. Why is that? And one of the other crazy things, so around that time, they started discovering that the plaques are antimicrobial. They actually engulf bacteria and viruses and other things in the brain. They also pick up heavy metals, and so they're part of the immune system. It's an immune response to form these plaques to try to sequester these bacteria and viruses. And the tangles, they're just starting to really look closely at whether this is also part of the immune system.
Yeah.
It might be a way of basically killing off the cells that are infected to try to prevent spread to other cells. It could be something like that going on. They just don't know yet, but it did everything that all this research is aiming to get rid of plaques. And then now there's new research trying to get rid of tangles. Well, when they do it, they get worse. So it's not the right way. They're not heading in the right direction with that particular research, in my opinion. But Steve, he passed away in 2016 from Alzheimer's. It was Alzheimer's disease. And he was eating great up until about the last 2 weeks. And he, is from the neck down, his body was perfect, in perfect condition. It was just such a tragedy, what happened to Steve. And but I did lose him. So it did have an unhappy ending. But, like I said, it had a happy middle, because I feel like we gained almost 4 extra better quality years. They were better than the year before we started the coconut oil. And I mean, he even went back. He was able to volunteer at the hospital I worked at. He did that for over a year until he got that stupid semagasistat that kind of did that in. But so it's worth it. And he was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's at the point we started it. So I think, what if we had learned about this 4 or 5 years earlier? When the very first study came out, there was a study in 2004 that came out about this, the pilot study, but I hadn't heard anything about the MCT oil pilot study. And I think if I knew about 4 years earlier when he was first diagnosed, I might still have him here with me. It's very possible. And I've been following some people very long term now, and 10 years that they've been stable and improving. And I'm actually just finished writing a 3rd edition of my first book, and I included some of these people. A lady from Germany that we met in 2010 with Lewy body dementia, who's going strong, and 12 years later, and she started coconut oil, and then she started overnight fasting and more ketogenic diet. She added all these things. A man with Parkinson's who is 8 years out now, who he was so debilitated in his late 50s that he had to stop working. He would sit in a chair, moving, with these abnormal movements all day. And now he's up and about. He just went to the Tour de France, and he went out to California, and he's doing great, so, and he's doing several different ketogenic strategies, so there are these stories, these people that are doing really well. So that's the reward for me. Sadly, it didn't work out for Steve, but I've heard from really hundreds. I've collected, more than 500 little case reports myself, just emails, and a lot of people out there are benefiting from it. And
so, as far as coconut oil, any part of the coconut, except the water, doesn't really have much of the oil in it, if any. But these are just some other coconut things that you can do to get oil, from it. Coconut milk is loaded with coconut oil, so that you can get medium chain triglycerides with that, and it's actually very good. People ask me about coconut capsules all the time. I figured that will probably be one of the questions, so I'll just go ahead and address it now. But each capsule has only 1 gram, and there's 14 grams in a tablespoon of coconut oil. So you'd have to take 14 capsules to get 1 tablespoon of coconut oil. So that's very expensive and very hard thing to swallow, literally. Steve, we increased him over time, so that he was getting it at least 3 times a day, and finally 4 times a day. And Dr. Veach measured his ketone levels after he took coconut oil and MCT oil. And with coconut oil, his level of ketones peaked at about 3 hours, and they were still hanging around like 7 or 8 hours later. With MCT oil, the ketone level was higher, but it peaked at 90 minutes, and they were gone at 3 hours. So, like say the product AC1202, which is Axona, the dosage is once a day. Well, what it's gone after 3 hours or 4 hours. What do you do the rest of the day? So we started adding it to his diet for the other meals to try to keep ketones available to his brain 24/7. So that's why we do that. And then, coconut oil, the lauric acid in it, one of the medium chain triglycerides, has antimicrobial, antibacterial, type of properties to it. And so there are other good things about coconut oil, and that's what he improved with in the first place. So I've always been leery of taking that out of his diet and substituting it with just MCT oil. So this is just a recommendation for how to start. If you, some people, if they try to take too much oil too fast, will have diarrhea, and it's like major diarrhea. So I usually recommend to people that they start with 1 or 2 teaspoons, like 1 teaspoon, 2 or 3 times a day with food, and just increase it slowly as they tolerate it, up to the point of tolerance. The more you take, the more ketone you will produce, basically.